the Agricultural Research Department of a meat packer. This man has also been a producer of livestock, taught marketing livestock and meats at an agricultural college, and was an employee of the United States Department of Agriculture.
I appreciate what has been said about my past. I assure you it has been an interesting life. As our good friend has said, I've spent many years in this field. I've grown livestock, sold them, and taught about livestock and meat so long that it seems funny to think that I ever wondered whether I would be a farmer, a storekeeper, a cowboy, or a teacher. All that uncertainty disappeared about 25 years ago. I then heard a man tell about livestock byproducts and many other interesting things relating to the meat business. The decision was made right then to earn my living and do most of my thinking about meat. I am happy to tell you some of the things that I have learned about the livestock and meat industry. I always learn a lot from history. So I'm going to use some history in the telling of my story. Before doing that, however, I want to make one very up-to-date observation. Here is an airliner. It's not a warplane, it's just an airplane with people in it going places. From Minneapolis to London, maybe. Chicago to Hong Kong. Or maybe just from Laramie, Wyoming to Kokomo, Indiana. Anyway, it's got people in it, and they're traveling. And the most important thing about the world today is that people travel. They roar across the country on trains, fly or sail overseas on planes and ships. Some places they do like Jim Davis, whom I used to know, pile all their things on a wagon and move a whole family to better land or greener pastures. Now, most of you, when you think about going to some new place to earn a living, think about some means of locomotion. That is, how are you going to get there? But that's only the end of the story. The beginning is food. And until the human race learned how to preserve food so as to be able to transport it, they were tied to the places where their food was grown. This made them the slaves of the earth, not its master. I like to think of my business as the first great step in setting man free. Not as some historians say, fire, or the wheel, or the lever, and certainly not the airplane. Nothing at all but the efficient preservation of food. Maybe this is a place for me to tell you what you might call my idea of the philosophy of the food business. What makes it important, and how its development here in the United States has given millions of people a chance to do something more than just make a living. Every business meets a need or it goes out of business. Ours is better than most because it meets three needs. First, last, and always, of course, is nutrition. We keep the people of the world alive, but we don't make them slaves to food. As I said before, we send good food after them everywhere they go. That's the second need we meet. We make people free to live where they can find work and be happy. The third need we meet is the lands. Because we know about food and how to ship it and still keep it fresh and tasting good, we don't have to grow corn where it's better to grow grass. Neither do we have to raise cattle where there's nothing good for them to eat. This frees the land for its best use. Some history writers claim that the first domesticated animals were brought over here by Leif Erikson 400 years before Columbus's time. Others say Spanish explorers were responsible. I don't know which is true, but a shipload of hogs were brought to the United States from Cuba in 1538, and a boatload of sheep and cattle arrived in Virginia in 1609. It doesn't matter much where, how, or when the animals first got here. It is true that in the early 1700s, most of the livestock industry was located along the Atlantic seaboard. And that isn't peculiar, because most of the people lived in that place. Remember, meat couldn't be handled far and kept eatable without using lots of salt, so the people and the animals tended to stay put. There are many farms today that are a lot like what you'd have found in Massachusetts or Maryland in the 1700s. Everything the family needed was raised on the place. Then there were the big plantations down south with their cash crops and own gardens, cattle, smoke houses, and so forth. What little trading there was took place more than likely over a pasture fence or across a New England stone wall. The first real livestock trading we know much about was at Brighton near Boston. Brighton gave birth to the livestock commission man as we know him. Bargaining, buying, selling by individuals hasn't changed right down to today. The elder G.F. Swift, as a boy, came from Barnstable on Cape Cod to trade in the Brighton stockyards. He founded a large business because he followed the livestock west and recognized there was a big job to do moving meat across the country. Lots of the Brighton drovers today are sons and grandsons of men that trailed their cattle, sometimes clear from Aroostook County, Maine, to Boston. And there's a few old-timers still living in Brighton, like Francis Ellis, who remembers back to the days before railroading, refrigeration, and byproducts made a great industry out of a small business. I like to talk to old-timers like Ellis or Tom Keenan and Harry Kelly at the Brighton yards, or Aidan Putnam, who trades in livestock like his grandfather did before him. Aidan will tell you his grandfather's story in his own words, the way he told it to me one day at the yards after he was through trading.
My granddad generally figured on 2 trips a year to Brighton Market. But Grandpa wanted a price, so he generally waited until some traveler brought word that meat was maybe getting a little scarce. Then he'd sit out one morning before sunup with a dozen head of cattle and a couple of helpers. It was a great day, I'll tell you, when one of the boys got big enough to go along. The helpers, Pa or hired men, walked up front, and Grandpa followed, riding or walking his horse, depending on which part of him needed a rest. 3 men and a dozen animals and a boy didn't look too efficient, but Grandpa always counted on picking up a load on the way. Mayhew over to Bellows Falls generally had another dozen. So did Bartlett at Keene, and Eaton down to Fitchburg. They'd see Grandpa coming and stop what they were doing and come down to the gate for talk. First, they'd exchange what news they had. Then Mayhew'd say, buying or selling? And Grandpa'd say, both. Trading, too. And Mayhew would look at our stock, and Grandpa'd look at his, and Mayhew'd talk like he hadn't ought to sell, and Grandpa'd say prices down to Brighton were so low he hadn't ought to buy. Sometimes they'd talk all afternoon, and Grandpa'd help drive his stock into Mayhew's pasture, and he'd give 'em supper, and then they'd spend the night in the barn. There was never much hurry. Grandpa liked to give the stock plenty of rest and feed, so they wouldn't be all skin and bone time they got to Brighton. Mayhew would maybe come down to the barn just before bedtime to say if he did decide to sell, what did Grandpa pay? Of course, they traded by the animal, not by the pound those days, and the bargaining kept up till they agreed on a price, and Mayhew would say good night, he hadn't ought to sell, and Grandpa would say good night, he hadn't ought to buy. So by the middle of the trip down, that's after 3 weeks on the road, there'd be enough cattle for all the men to be busy holding them to the road and keeping them moving, keeping them from fighting. 8 to 10 miles was a good day's traveling. And every second or third day, they'd stop to graze. It was a good life, I'll tell you. Traveling, seeing people, talking, trading, and then the excitement of the Cattle Fair Hotel. But Grandpa'd never hurry. He knew what he paid and what he had to get, though he never mentioned it. No, sir. He thought it was a sin or bad luck to set a price. That had to come natural. Two people, one to buy, the other to sell, coming to agree on a price that had to be fair because it was based on how bad one wanted to buy and how bad the other one wanted to sell. Then a trade was made, and another, and another. And after a while, Grandpa had his leather pouch full of money, and nothing else left but his horse. He'd sell that, too, if he got a price. If it was before bank closing, he'd go over to the bank and shake out the silver dollars on the counter and...
Oh, yeah? Wait a minute. I better take some of this. Gotta buy something for my wife. Bye.
Trust the bank to put the right amount on the books. Them days, there was no big packers. Weren't necessary. The livestock and people all lived close together. There was just some 60 slaughterers near Brighton that slaughtered in their own backyards for the Boston market. Slaughtered and saved nothing outside the meat but the hides. This seems a waste. Now we know what we do about byproducts. Most of the meat was sold next morning over to Faneuil Hall Market to Boston storekeepers. But some of it was pickled out to Marblehead and shipped to the West Indies in barrels and traded for sugar or rum or maybe once in a while a slave.
The number of animals marketed now may be different, but the business of buying and selling are the same. Aidan Putnam's grandfather bargained with Mayhew for cattle. The slaughterers bargained with Aidan's grandfather. And down in the market, the retailers bargained with the slaughterers. Then as now, there were no price tags placed on live animals. Then the population, and with it the livestock and meat industry, began to move westward. Meat packing centers sprang up in Buffalo, Pittsburgh, and places beyond. But the first Middle Western town to really get famous as a centralized livestock market was Cincinnati. There was a time in the middle of the 1800s when Cincinnati was known all over the world as Porkopolis. Because it was set here on the Ohio River in the days when the best transportation was by river, Cincinnati furnished pork for much of the South way down to New Orleans. Chicago, in 1837, when the city was 4 years old, set up a small stockyard near the famous old Myrick's Tavern. There was little change up to the war between the states, but by 1890, the number of cattle equaled 80% of the population. That means nearly 50 million head of cattle. The country was growing fast, and it was going to be necessary to use not only the agricultural part of the Middle West, but also the vast ranges of the Far West. In the early days, the railroads didn't go all the way out to the range to meet the cattle, so there was nothing for the livestock producers to do but to bring their cattle to the railroads. They took to the trails, driving their cattle overland, and the length of their travels made Aden Putnam's grandfather's trips from Vermont to Brighton look like a ride to town on a Saturday night. Over the Chisholm Trail, for instance, where the average drive was about 10 to 12 miles a day, it took almost 3 months to get to a railroad cattle shipping point. And on the Dodge or Western Trail, which led from Texas through Oklahoma, Nebraska, and Wyoming to Montana, the trip to Wyoming alone took more than 6 months. To give you an idea of how fast things were moving in 1870, 300,000 head of cattle reached Abilene, Kansas. And the next year, more than 600,000 loaded on the trains at that old cattle town. Meat packing isn't the only well-run business in the United States. While the drovers were cluttering up the overland trails, the railroad men began to get busy too, and they ran their lines right out to the range so that nobody's ranch was too far from a railroad's loading pens. Now, maybe you can see why Chicago got to be a great packing center. Nearly every railroad runs to it, but none of them runs through it. Don't ask me why. I never did know the answer to that one. With improved transportation and the trains running right out to the steers, one more thing had to be done before every head of cattle anywhere in this country was available as good fresh meat everywhere else. When we learned how to put ice boxes on wheels, this problem was solved. In the 1880s, the refrigerator car was doing a good job. After that, it wasn't necessary to ship all of our live animals right to the point where they were eaten. Thus, the waste of hauling live animals instead of meat was reduced. We slaughtered wherever it was most economical and shipped meat by fast refrigerated cars right to the community that ate it. First, let me show you on a map what happened. Then I'll tell you the story of it. Here's the USA, 3,000 miles across, with the best range country for starting cattle and lambs over here, and the most eaters of meat way over here. That means a stretch of more than 2,000 miles from range to dinner table for a large amount of the meat. And those miles are covered on the hoof, in trucks and trains, and then in trucks again. A carefully planned operation every step of the way, using the range and the corn belt the way nature intended them to be used, and transporting nutrition, that means good food, from wherever there happens to be a supply to wherever there's a demand. Out here in the livestock areas, meat packing just naturally got concentrated in the larger cities. And here in Chicago, the town no railroad goes through, the yards grew, and now some of the chief nationwide meat packers have their central offices located there. Now, I'm going to tell you how a steer at normal times gets from the range in Wyoming to a dinner table in Provincetown, Massachusetts, on the tip end of Cape Cod. Grass is the only crop that grows in the range country. The steers whose travels we're going to watch were raised out there. When ready for fattening, they needed another feed besides grass, so it was a question of shipping corn to the range or bringing the cattle to the corn belt. The cattle were moved east because they were then nearer to the nation's largest consuming centers. The large consumer demand of the Pacific Coast has caused a big movement of livestock from the Intermountain region to that section. The trip from the range into the Corn Belt, which took months before the railroads were built, now takes just a few days. And here are the steers being unloaded with a lot of others for fattening in the Corn Belt. Corn Belt feeding does something besides fatten the animals. It gives consumers high-quality beef the year round. In the old days, meat was about as seasonal as strawberries, but in normal times, the best grade is available everywhere, every month of the year. Here is how they trade in the Chicago yards. The methods and customs are similar in all of the central livestock markets. That man in there bargaining with the commission man is one of many prospective buyers. Only the buyer or buyers of one firm go into the pen at a time. It is an old custom and one which has resulted in no lawsuits in the last 75 years that anything said in the pen by the buyer or seller is binding as long as both of them are in the alleys. If the seller and buyer cannot agree on the price, then the buyer rides away and another comes in. The representative of one packer has not been able to make a deal, and now another prospective buyer is going in. This looks like real business. The commission man is getting his price now. The deal is made and our steers are going out to be weighed and paid for. Ownership of the cattle does not change until they have gone over the scale. The minute they are weighed, they are the property of the buyer. There go the steers down the runway. 48 hours afterward, they are loaded onto a car like this and sent to market. The old tradition of no price tag remains. The edible portion of a steer is just so much meat. At a branch house in Boston or other eastern centers, it is hung in the cooler to be sold sometime during the week of its arrival. In peacetime, a customer comes in like this one is doing now. He knows quality and he knows many packer salesmen. If he likes the price, he buys. If he doesn't, he may go next door to a competitor. Well, we're lucky this time. The price is right. The buyer buys and the salesman sells. And one good slice of juicy roast beef from those steers that started from the ranch weeks ago is in the sandwich of a youngster playing on the beach at the end of Cape Cod. The animal and meat have traveled 2,000 or 3,000 miles. I think it is fair to say that the meat carries nutrition from the range right down here to the beach. You have seen how livestock is shipped and sold. And now I would like to tell you something about the methods, operations, and functions of the meat packer under normal conditions. This large business is handled by over 1,300 concerns who, according to the last census, own and operate approximately 1,478 plants. Some of these 1,300 concerns are nationwide packers, while others are only local. One place or another, they are all in competition with each other. Here is what actually happens in the business. In the main office of every nationwide meat packer, there are many departments. Included among them are the beef, lamb, veal, and pork departments. All operate much in the same general way. I showed you how steers go to market, so let's stick to the beef department as an example. The afternoon before and early each morning before the day's buying begins, the beef department is hard at work studying reports on the numbers, the grades, the weights, and the prices at which beef carcasses were sold all over the country on the day before. Before sending telegrams to the cattle buyers, the beef man also studies the weather and other factors which influence the demand for beef. Telegrams from different consuming areas give him important information. He knows that a sudden warm day affects the purchases of beef. He also knows that heavy rains, snow, and cold will keep housewives from the market. Besides that, each morning the head of the beef department has before him a United States Department of Agriculture record of all the cattle received at all the principal livestock markets for the day that is just beginning, together with similar information about a week ago and a year ago. He studies these figures to see whether cattle receipts are running light or heavy. After careful analysis, the head of the beef department telegraphs the men whose job it is to do the actual buying of the cattle. These instructions are by no means ironclad. Buyers are urged to use their own judgment in bidding, and the instructions emphasize this by always including the word, "try to buy." The use of dressed beef prices in the instructions instead of prices of the live animals gives the cattle buyer freedom to use his own judgment and to make allowances for fill or the amount of meat as well as the grades of meat his expert eye knows the animals will yield. This makes it necessary for the buyer to figure the live cattle price from the beef price, which the head of the beef department has given him. In order to do this, the buyer must take into consideration the amount the byproducts will sell for, as well as the expenses of doing business, in addition to what the meat will probably bring. The branch house manager has many ways of figuring what the consumer is doing. The branch house has rails like these on which beef that is sold is left there by retail meat dealers. If the meat accumulates on the rails, the branch house manager knows that his customers are well supplied and that meat is not selling very fast. On the other hand, when the sold rails are bare, the movement of meat is big and the demand for meat means higher prices for both the meat and livestock. The branch manager has another way of figuring the price that he should ask for the supply of meat available. It is all right for customers to leave like this one, provided they come back later on. But if a lot of retailers come in and leave without buying and do not come back, the branch manager knows his price is too high for the supply and demand of the meat available. Now suppose the reverse were true. A customer comes in, a price is given, and he buys the meat. Another customer comes in, and the same thing happens. Then the branch manager knows his price is too low, and he had better raise it. Meat, because of its perishability, makes a problem that is not found in many other products. The meat packer does not deliberately buy livestock when the price is low, slaughter the animals, freeze the meat, and sell when the price is high. The meat packer carries over as little meat as possible. As a matter of fact, only about 1 9/10% of the total beef, and 9/10% of the total lamb, and 6% of the pork is ever frozen in 1 year. Each week, all meat slaughtered to be sold that week must be sold. It is a little surprising to some people to learn that there is often a variation of 25% or more in the amount of beef, veal, lamb, and pork eaten by consumers one week with another. This chart of weekly cattle slaughter in those plants operating under United States Department of Agriculture inspectors shows approximately 20% more cattle slaughtered the week of May 29 than the week before. It means that consumers must eat 20% more beef the second week than the first. It is by lowering the price in large consuming areas that the packer and retailer move the additional supply of meat from the livestock sent in by producers. Unfortunately, these lower prices for the meat make lower prices for livestock. Most producers know about the long-term livestock production cycles. These production cycles depend in part on the profit or loss livestock producers have, and in part on the time it takes to breed, grow, and feed animals. After losing money and decreasing production, livestock producers cannot suddenly produce a new supply of cattle or lambs or hogs in a single growing season the way you can corn. So even under the most favorable conditions, it takes about 2 years to get hogs from the low production point to peak production. In the same way, sheep require 5 to 6 years and cattle 7 to 8. I told you before that the local meat packer was in competition with the nationwide packer, but I didn't tell you the difference between the two. The local packer buys livestock generally in the local market and sells all his meat near his plant. But as I intimated in the beginning of my talk, 2/3 of the livestock is produced west of the Mississippi River, and 2/3 of the meat is eaten east of it. Some persons or concerns have to bring this meat the 1,000 or 2,000 miles from where it is produced to where it is eaten. That job makes the nationwide meat packer a necessity. Operating all over the country, he buys the surplus in the big livestock producing areas and distributes it in the big consuming areas where livestock production is low. The nationwide meat packer cannot operate with 1,000 miles on the average between the producers of livestock and the consumers of meat without using every thinkable economy and efficiency. Let's take a look inside a meat plant for a minute. A lot of people identify the conveyor system with the automobile business, but a long time before there was any such thing as an automobile, the meat packers developed a conveyor system or movable chain pretty much as you see it here. The worker stands still and the product is brought to him. Now let's go to another part of the plant. Here is the inside of a research laboratory where there are over 100 scientific workers, chemists, chemical engineers, bacteriologists, and their assistants. That chemist over there, for example, is experimenting with cattle hoofs in an attempt to make better and more uses of them. These scientists carry the responsibility for continuous improvement in food products and for the assurance of uniformity in quality from day to day. Chemists and other research workers have been active in the meat packing business for more than 50 years. About 1/3 of the weight of a steer as it comes to the packing plant is unrecoverable. A good deal of that is water, which will always be useless. Finding new and better uses for the unrecoverable material outside of the water is an important job of these research workers. Byproducts have such an important place in the price producers receive for their livestock and in what consumers pay for meats that I want to discuss them for a few seconds. I never lose interest in comparing our operations with those of other manufacturers. Farm machinery people buy iron ore, make steel, mold or cast parts, and put them together to make a mower or some other kind of machine. We buy a finished product, a steer for example, tear it apart to make roasts, steaks, hides, medicines, and so forth. We disassemble a finished product, Most other manufacturers assemble materials to make a finished one. Meat packers are credited with developing a business in which efficiency has reached a very high point. Likewise, livestock producers, breeders, and agricultural college people deserve credit for many improvements in the types and methods of feeding livestock. All you need to do to realize this is to look at these pictures of the different types of cattle that have been in America from its settlement to the present time. Cattle now weigh as much at 12 or 14 months of age as they did 50 or 60 years ago when 5 years old. The advantages of feeding a balanced ration are known by millions of stockmen. The changes in types of cattle that have been pictured here could be paralleled in both hogs and sheep. The livestock and meat industry, therefore, has been progressive. The nationwide packer back in the 1890s applied his economics and efficiencies in the handling of meats to the handling of other foods. Because he distributes butter, eggs, poultry, and cheese right along with the meat, he can do a first-rate job in loading both railroad cars and trucks. Inside this railroad car, for instance, the meats are suspended from the roof, and the smaller items and the boxed goods are loaded right underneath. A delivery truck can deliver 16 items at a lower cost per unit than 16 trucks each handling one item of the same amount. Another economy lies in the fact that the salesman, whom you see going along in this car, sells all 16 items to the same type of dealer. That means a lower unit of sales cost. Nationwide meat packers use two ways of selling and distributing their products. They are direct sales from plants and branch houses. I'll explain them. Small towns and cities are served by direct sales from plants. The plant sales method means a route along a railroad or highway over which a salesman travels regularly, taking orders from retail dealers in the different communities along the route. The salesman forwards these orders to his plant sales headquarters, which is in a city where one of his company's packing plants is located. The orders are filled at the headquarters and are loaded either in a refrigerated railroad car or truck in station order. By that I mean orders for towns farthest along the line are loaded first in the ends of the car, and products for closer towns are packed nearer the door. Arrangements are always made ahead of time to have a truck meet the car at the railroad station. The trucker hauls the product and delivers it right into the store. Branch houses are wholesale meat stores where refrigeration is available for perishable products. The staff includes a manager, salesman, credit men, and bookkeepers. They are located in large consuming centers where retailers come to bargain and buy. Some provision must be made for getting meat and other products from packing plants to the branch houses. Here's a beef department expert working out a temporary schedule for a beef car to supply a branch house. When the majority of the order from a branch house requires beef, then the car becomes what is known as a beef car. If the biggest part of the order happened to be fresh pork, the car would become a pork car, and its loading and movement would then be planned by the pork department, and so on for the other kinds of meat. For example, here is the way it might happen. The beef man reports that he is placing a beef car for Albany, New York, at St. Joe. That man talking to the beef man is from the pork department, and he points out that they are short of fresh pork at St. Joe. In order to make the best disposition of space, it would be better for the car for Albany to go from St. Paul or Chicago. The beef man finds that he has a surplus at both St. Paul and Chicago and says, okay, let's have the Albany car go from Chicago. So now we have two men in agreement. But the veal and lamb department man leans across the table to object. Chicago will not do for us because the kind of calves and lambs Albany wants is at St. Paul. How about shifting the order from Chicago to St. Paul? Everybody agrees and the car is planned for. Making plans for distribution is just about as complicated as issuing instructions to buyers. On the one hand, there is the total supply to be taken into consideration. On another, the demand is different in different parts of the country. If that demand were just for meat or butter or eggs, it would be simple. But there are all sorts of peculiar consumer preferences. For example, New England likes its beef from heavy animals, Chicago from lighter ones, and New York is in between. Boston likes brown eggs. New York prefers them white. New York wants uncolored, unsalted butter. Boston wants theirs salted and highly colored. There is no difference in quality, you understand. It is just consumer preferences which it is our job to take care of. This nationwide distribution setup takes care of both country areas and the areas of large consuming power. It enables the nationwide meat packer to keep in constant touch with supply and demand in all sections of the United States. An oversupply may develop in one place when there is an undersupply in another. As a good general arranges his troops to meet every kind of situation, the nationwide meat packer shifts products from oversupply to the undersupply area. This, of course, makes for a better balance of prices to producers and consumers than would be the case if prices were dependent upon an oversupply in only a few of the large consuming centers. Let me show you how this happens with, say, a carload of eggs or butter or poultry. It is loaded in Springfield, Missouri, and it is headed for Richmond, Virginia, where, according to the present report, the eggs or butter or poultry will be needed. At the central office in Chicago, a report comes in.
Harry Smith, Chicago speaking.
This is Barnes, Richmond. Can you use that car someplace else that's coming to me from Springfield?
Sure, Barnes, I can use it. Bye. Operator, get me Birmingham. Clyde, I got that car of butter, eggs, and poultry you asked for.
When'll it be here?
Tomorrow afternoon.
Okay, send it along.
All right. Hello, Telegraph Department. Take this wire to Frisco Railroad at Memphis, Tennessee. Divert SR car number 6184, build Richmond to Birmingham, Alabama. Signed, Harry Smith.
In normal times, nearly everybody can satisfy his peculiar appetite no matter where he lives. You remember when we started talking, I told you that our business, and when I say our, I mean that of the livestock producer, the packer, and retailer of meat, was important because it met three needs. It made the right kind of food available, transported it no matter where people live so that they could live wherever they liked or could find a job, and it made it possible to use the land to the best advantage. We have traced that story from its beginnings down to the present. You have also seen how we develop byproducts which will not only serve other needs, but will also serve to make meat cheaper and pay the producer more for his livestock. Efficiency has been increased so that now a nationwide packer can buy animals from a livestock producing area, make them into meat in Chicago or some other plant, save all of the byproducts, and deliver the meat on an economical basis to the same area from which the animals come. We have seen how the price the producer receives for his livestock is governed by what the packer can get for the meat and the byproducts. Maybe some of you fellows are planning to go into one end of this business, and you would like to get an idea of how the dollar that is spent is spread across retailing, preparing, and growing of livestock. I would like to be able to tell you the story in terms of the consumer dollar, but honestly, that is so complicated that I doubt if anybody could give an accurate picture of it. You can't tell, for instance, how much of the consumer dollar goes back to the livestock producer from a pair of shoes, let us say, or from a suit of underwear, or from an ounce of adrenaline or pepsin. It is more accurate to tell you what percentage producers receive of the dollar that the packer gets from the retailers and those to whom he sells his byproducts. If you take figures from any of the major meat packing companies and include everything, dairy and poultry products, livestock, cottonseed, soybeans, and everything else they handle, it would look something like this. During the 5-year period from 1938 to 1942 inclusive, on the average, about 75 cents out of every dollar the packer received went to the producer. Almost 12 cents was paid out for labor, and over 3 cents for transportation. A little more than 9 cents was spent for supplies, rents, taxes, depreciation, interest, and so forth. In the end, 1 11/100 of a cent of the meat packer's sales dollar is left for profit. On a pound basis, the profit equals about 1/4 of a cent per pound for each pound of products handled. We've been studying the livestock and meat industry for about a classroom period, but that's been only long enough to hit the high spots. I hope we can meet again another time and talk some more. And I know I speak for all the meat packers when I say, if you ever get to a town where we have a plant, come in and see us. Producers, packers, and retailers are all in this together. By satisfying needs, by keeping people alive and healthy, and doing it efficiently and economically, right from the farm or ranch to the dinner table, we can each make $1 or $2. It's a nice and interesting way to earn a living.
Thank you very much. Class dismissed.